Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, amid civil unrest over the death of George Floyd and protests sweeping the nation, it has been a tumultuous week for America. White House spokesman Hogan Gidley joins host Lisa Brady to discuss how President Trump is answering critics questioning his actions during this trying time and his plan to help reunite the nation. Also, the presidential election is less than 5 months away. Fox News Sunday anchor Chris Wallace joins host Chris Foster to discuss the commander-in-chief's feud with Twitter, mail-in voting, and how protests could affect the 2020 race. Plus commentary from former Utah Congressman and Fox News contributor Jason Chaffetz. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Geraldo Rivera.
I'm Emily Campagno.
And I'm Eric Shawn. This is a Fox News Rundown.
Friday, June 5th, 2020. I'm Lisa Brady. Love him or hate him, the president certainly has a lot on his plate. First the pandemic and its shutdowns, now civil unrest sweeping the country, while he also has to fight off the critics.
You have the right president for the right time in that no one moves faster than he does. No one is more up to the challenge than he is.
I'm Chris Foster. Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace says things have been better.
The rioting and the looting, which was horrible, and, you know, they're lawbreakers. They should be put in jail. And then put that in the context of we've been going through this coronavirus for 3 months, and 40 million Americans are unemployed, and we're facing a tough time in this country right now.
And I'm Jason Chaffetz. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
As protests spurred by the death of George Floyd continue, U.S. Attorney General William Barr telling the country the Justice Department will do its part.
Our Constitution mandates equal protection of the laws, and nothing less is acceptable.
The 4 fired officers charged in Floyd's death in Minnesota remain under separate Justice Department and FBI probes for possible civil rights violations. But Barr is at the center of a related controversy, the clearing of a park near the White House Monday, just before the president's photo op at St. John's Church.
There was no correlation between our tactical plan of moving the perimeter out by 1 block and the president's going over to the church.
It was supposed to be cleared earlier in the day, but it's the level of force used, or at least the appearance of it, that remains a flashpoint for some, including President Trump's former defense chief, James Mattis, describing him as the first president in his lifetime to not even pretend to try to unite the country, and accusing him of using a militarized response to violate constitutional rights.
That's a ridiculous claim about moving protesters out of Lafayette Square being a flashpoint.
Hogan Gidley is a deputy assistant to the president and principal deputy press secretary.
The flashpoint, I believe, started days before, if not the night before, in which these people, many of whom were peaceful, were standing there protesting, while others decided that they were going to burn down a church. They were going to burn down the bathroom facilities on Lafayette Square. They were going to hurl projectiles at our brave men and women in law enforcement, whether they be frozen water bottles, rocks. They discovered pipes and other sharp objects hidden and stashed throughout the city. They'd receive intelligence reports that they were going to move on law enforcement and try and hurt them and kill them. So the flashpoint came nights before, and it's almost as though the media is telling us, shame on you for not letting these criminals come back and finish what they started. You should have let them burn that church to the ground on the second night. You should have let them destroy monuments across this city. And you should have let them break into shops and stores and crash through the windows and steal all of the merchandise. You should have let them do that, is what the media and many on the left are telling us. And this president is not going to allow that, because his job, the federal government's job, is to protect the American people. And we've said that time and time again. He's done that time and time again, and this instance is no different.
Maybe the timing is really
part of the issue here? Because I know that the White House has said the Attorney General actually ordered the square cleared earlier in the day. I mean, do you think maybe if it had happened then instead of later, right before the president walked over, that the reaction would have been any different?
I don't, because what you're trying to do now is ascribe sensibility and common sense to a group of people with a design to destroy, a design to defame. They'd done it the night before. They prepared to do it the next day. Just because they were waiting for the cover of darkness to do it again doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter what time you try to move people out of the way. If they're throwing rocks at you, if they're throwing projectiles at you, if they're becoming violent, if they're climbing statues, if they're climbing buildings, if they're trying to set fires, they're a mob for a reason, because they lack that rationality. And so the timing of it, I think, is a scapegoat. The fact is, they were preparing to do the same thing in Lafayette Square that night that they did the previous night, and the president wants our streets to be safe. He wants American families to feel a sense of security across this country, and quite frankly, as American citizens, we deserve that.
The president has offered his own responses to what Mattis wrote in The Atlantic this week, calling him the world's most overrated general. But other former top military officials are openly criticizing the president, too. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi calls the presence of troops at the Lincoln Memorial stunning and scary. She's raising concern about hundreds of National Guard members from other areas brought into D.C.
We're in a very difficult situation. It has to be handled with care. We certainly want to support peaceful demonstrations. We all reject violence.
In a tweet Thursday night, President Trump calling arsonists, looters, criminals, and anarchists the problem. He's also called for healing, not hatred. So what's his plan? How does he try to unite the country?
The president's also called for healing, not hatred. What is his plan for that? How is he trying to unite the country?
Well, he's given several speeches on the subject, demonstrating an understanding of the grave injustice to George Floyd. You'll remember at the SpaceX launch, the president's eloquent words pointed out the fact that not only was he appalled and sickened by the video of the police officer senselessly and needlessly kneeling on a man's neck to the point of death, but he also called the family, expressed his sincere condolences, told them that justice must be done in the case.
We will stand with the family of George Floyd, with the peaceful protesters, and with every law-abiding citizen who wants decency, civility, safety, and security.
You know, the president is responsible for protecting the American people, which he is doing. He's also one who wants to ensure that the tensions de-escalate, that the temperatures come down across the country. He's tried to do that not just with law and order, but with a sense of understanding of where we are as a nation. Let's not forget, it was this president who sent the FBI and the DOJ in to expedite this case because he wants to see justice done. He wants to see it done quickly. This president has stood up for all people across this country, regardless of race, religion, color, or creed. He's done it before. He'll do it again.
He does say he's done more for the African American community than any president since Abraham Lincoln. I mean, we've heard him talk many times about historically low unemployment rates before the pandemic hit, of course. How else does he make that case?
One of the things he did was codify funding for historically black colleges and universities into law. No previous president had done that. He gave them more money than any president in history. But it's not just about giving people money or ensuring education. He also developed opportunity zones in hundreds of communities, cities across this country, where you'd have a public-private partnership and industry would go in and rebuild some of the inner cities. And in fact, when we were humming along as an economy and the record growth we saw in the African American community and other areas, it was actually opportunity zones that were far outpacing that increase by about 8%. You saw a rise in wages and a rise in jobs being given in those communities. That's also very important. Criminal justice reform was a significant piece of legislation as well, something that no previous president had done, but many had talked about. So many in the African American community and those in the minority communities were given disproportionately high sentences for various crimes, and he wanted to make sure that injustice was corrected. He did that as well. So there are lots of things this president has done, not because of someone's race, but because it was right to do.
Any concern at the White House that this civil unrest and all the damage, that it could slow the pandemic recovery? And are you prepared for a possible second wave of coronavirus?
We're looking into that as well. I mean, let's not forget it was the media who just a week previous was saying, how dare anyone go out and enjoy themselves on Memorial Day, and social distancing has to be kept up, and you must wear a mask. All of that went out the window when people started, rioting in the streets. No one in the media said that was an issue at all. No one even cared. It was almost like we're seeing articles now saying the virus doesn't even, it's like it fails to exist once people start rioting and looting. That doesn't make any sense at all. We know what social distancing did to get us to the point to begin to reopen, and we know what masks did to help protect the American people. We hope people are sensible and about that. We want to reopen, but we want to do it in a rational, reasonable, responsible way. They were doing that, and I think the majority of Americans are doing that. But in some of these major cities where we saw spikes before in coronavirus, we hope that the people who decide to protest do it peacefully, number one, but they do it in a manner that's in line with our guidance and our guidelines, that you do wear a mask, you do socially distance, because that's how we begin to slow the spread. We've done it. You've seen numbers going down in these metropolitan areas, and we're hoping they don't go up because of coronavirus, but I imagine the data will let us know that one way or the other very shortly.
One last thing. I know I have to let you go. Any one of these things is a crisis. The pandemic, the tremendous hit to the economy, now the mass protests. Dealing with all of it, what's it like at the White House on a daily basis right now?
These are historic times. There's no question about that. I imagine many White Houses face a crisis or two during their time, but this administration, for whatever reason, has been faced with a lot of different types of attacks. Many of them have been political in nature. As you know, the complete hoax of a Russia meddling situation in which they accused the president of colluding with a foreign power, which was proven to be completely false. You saw some of that testimony with Rod Rosenstein saying he wouldn't have moved forward with this had he known then what he knows now. You've seen the impeachment. You've seen Kavanaugh. You've seen all of the ridiculous things they've tried to attack this president with from a political standpoint. And now we're facing, a pandemic, as you mentioned. It looks like it's going to be an active hurricane season as well. So it seems like it never stops. But, you have the right president for the right time in that no one moves faster than he does. No one is more up to the challenge than he is. No one has taken a stronger leadership role than he has and will continue to do. And so all the things he's done, in addition to just the crises that we faced, let's not forget about rebuilding the military, for example, the massive trade deals we had to protect the American worker, bring back jobs to this country, tax cuts that put more money in our pockets, all the major steps he's done, criminal justice reform, for example, HBCUs we just talked about as well. Those things, for heaven's sakes, are accomplishments on top of the relentless political assaults that he's faced. So it's an honor and privilege to work here every single day, and it's a blessing to work for this man because I can assure you this, in every conversation I have with him, whatever decision he makes, it boils down to one real question for him is, does it improve the lives of the American people? And if it does, he's going to do it.
Hogan Gidley, Deputy Assistant to the President and Principal Deputy Press Secretary, thank you so much for coming on the Rundown.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
This is Jason Chaffetz with your Fox News commentary coming up.
It has not been the best of times. Even as we reopen more businesses, we still have close to 1,000 Americans a day dying with the coronavirus. Tens of millions of Americans are still out of work. And there have now been 10 nights of protest over George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. There's been looting and terrible vandalism in some of those cities.
The riots themselves have been horrible. I will say I don't think they were as bad as 1968 when cities were literally on fire.
Chris Wallace is the host of Fox News Sunday.
You know, you combined together the Floyd murder, alleged murder, I guess I should say, which is about as wanton, as horrific to look at as any of these unfortunate things we've ever seen, and then the reaction, the protests, which I think are solid, and that's as old as the founders and the Constitution, but then the rioting and the looting, which was horrible, and they're lawbreakers. They should be put in jail, and then put that in the context of we've been going through this coronavirus for 3 months, and 40 million Americans are unemployed, and we're facing a tough time in this country right now.
Well, you've said a few times on this program that President Trump will be judged in November on his response to the coronavirus and the health and the job aspects there. Now you add this and the protests. Nobody said he caused the virus. Nobody said he killed George Floyd, but people are going to ask, has he made things better or worse than they could have been?
I think this was a very tough week for the president. And just think of who called him out this week. Regardless, I'm saying this now as a political analyst. I'm not saying this as somebody who's either for the president or against the president. I'm just cover the story. And you had the Episcopal Bishop of Washington call him out for having the photo op in front of St. John's Church. You had the Archbishop, the top Catholic official in Washington, call him out for the same thing and pushing peaceful protesters away. You had James Mattis, his first defense secretary, ream him on violating the Constitution, spent 3 years dividing the country, not uniting it. Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the same thing. And even Mark Esper, his current Secretary of Defense, breaking with him on using the military and invoking the Insurrection Act. I mean, forget the personalities involved. To have some of the top current and retired military brass and the two most important religious leaders in Washington all call you out, that's a bad week for any person.
Yeah, retired Marine General John Allen, he used to be in charge of the ISIS fight. He added his name onto the list, calling the president out. Now, with the caveat, again, that it's early, we always say that some of these presidential polls are looking really good for Biden. Did you see the new Fox polls in Arizona, Ohio, Wisconsin?
I did, but if you had to choose right now whether you, as a political team, you were for Biden or for Trump, you'd have to say Biden right now is the favorite.
All right, news aside, what I really want to talk about is your new book. It's out next Tuesday.
Oh, no, don't do that. Please, Chris, let's not talk about that.
I'm going to twist your arm and make you talk about your new book. Comes out next Tuesday the 9th. You were nice enough to send me a copy. I burned right through it. It's called Countdown 1945. Sell some for Father's Day and just tell people what it's about first.
Well, and I'm so pleased, and that's what people tell me. I mean, it's the story of the 116 days that changed the world. On April 12th, 1945, Truman finds out that he is the new president. FDR has died, and the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, takes him aside just after he's been sworn in and says, "You don't know anything about this, but we have been developing a super weapon for the last 3 years." That is literally the first that Truman ever heard about the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. 116 days later, he drops it on Hiroshima to try to end the war with Japan, the Second World War. And this is the story of those 116 days. And it's not just Truman and how he makes, I think, arguably the biggest decision that's ever been made. It's also the scientists at Los Alamos, the flight crew on Tinian Island that flew the Enola Gay. It's a woman on the home front named Ruth Sisson who's working in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and she's fiddling with these dials to try to keep the meter in the right spot, not to go in the red. She doesn't know what she's doing, really, except that she needs to keep the dial where it is. She's enriching uranium. And then there's also 10-year-old Hideko Tamura, who's a little girl who's at ground zero in Hiroshima when the bomb is dropped. And, like a movie, it's the White House, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hiroshima, and we toggled back and forth among all the different spots and all the different characters as we get closer and closer to August 6th when they drop the bomb.
Yeah, it really does kind of read like a movie or a miniseries where you bounce back and forth between these locations and these characters. I'm glad you brought up Ruth Sisson and Hideko Tomorrow. Like, it's those little stories. We all know about Oppenheimer and Truman, but this Ruth Sisson woman, she's one of thousands of people, thousands of Americans who worked on the bombs not knowing what they were doing until it was over.
Yeah, this is an extraordinary thing. First of all, I want to say that this is really, you can feel that however you feel about the decision to drop the bomb, and I come down in the end that Truman really had no choice. He had to drop it. But it's a story of American triumph, and all these people pulling together, whether it's scientists or the military or just people on the home front. Ruth Sisson, she's told you're doing something to help end the war, but she doesn't know. She's operating something called a Calitron machine. And there was a joke at the time, my job is so secretive, but I don't know what I'm doing. And she is a perfect example of that. And the reason that her story is so poignant is her boyfriend, later fiance and husband, Lawrence Huddleston, is an Army medic in the worst of the fighting over in Europe. And the war in Europe ends on May 8th. And then the question is, are all of these, the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers now going to be shipped over to the Pacific to help invade Japan? And the guesstimate was it was going to cause at least 500,000 American casualties, and the war was continue. This is in May, June of 45. The war was going to continue until November of 46, so another year and a half. So, she's looking at this as life and death. War in Europe is over. We won. My love is safe. And now is he going to be shipped to an even bloodier war in the Pacific?
Yeah, and also Truman, it hadn't really struck me. He was sort of a bit of an accidental president. I mean, 10 years before this, he was a county judge. He just kind of found himself in the Senate and then found himself on the ticket with FDR and then found himself as president and making one of the most monumental decisions the president ever had to make.
You're absolutely right. I mean, Roosevelt didn't even care who his vice president was. Henry Wallace was the current vice president. Remember, that was Roosevelt's third term. And the party felt that he was too far to the left, and there was frankly concern that Roosevelt, who seemed very worn down by the war, might not survive a fourth term, which he won in 1944. So they thought, we've got to get him off the ticket, Henry Wallace. And then who was it that they were going to put on the ticket? And they come on the name of this fairly backbench, not terribly well-known Missouri senator named Harry Truman, who only 2% in the Gallup poll, yes, they had polls back then, only 2% of Americans supported for vice president. And the calculation by the Democratic Party chiefs was, well, he'll hurt the ticket the least. So it was just he'll do the least harm. Let's make him the vice president. And Roosevelt completely cuts him out. He only meets privately. He's the vice president for 82 days, and Roosevelt only meets with him in private twice. So after he's sworn in and Stimson tells him about the Manhattan Project, that is the first that that Truman ever even knew that there was a project to try to develop an atom bomb. He didn't even know it existed. So you're right. And that is a phrase that's used about him, the accidental president.
Yeah, and you get a cool story about how he found out that he was president that I guess Nancy Pelosi shared with you, and that's in the book.
Well, that's how I came to write the book. Just real quickly, yeah. I was in a meeting with a bunch of reporters with Nancy Pelosi, and she says, this is the room where Truman got the call. You got to come to the White House on April 12th. And he hangs up the phone, and he says, Jesus Christ and General Jackson. And I'd been thinking about writing a book and trying to find a great moment, and that was the moment when I came up with the idea. Truman becomes president, and I didn't know how many days it was then. 116 days later, he drops the bomb.
And there's a documentary with it that's going to be on the channel Sunday?
Yes, there's a Fox News documentary on Sunday night, assuming, and let's hope for a lot of more important reasons, we don't have any riots in the streets, 10 o'clock Eastern time on Sunday. And I have to say, I was somewhat involved, and but it was the documentary unit at Fox. It is a heck of an hour. I promise you. You will like it, but it's no substitute for buying and reading the book. So there you go.
All right. Well, I know a father-in-law who's probably going to get one for Father's Day.
I was going to say, perfect Father's Day gift. And that's frankly one of the reasons that the publisher, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster, they're a lot smarter than me. They said, you got to put this out in June as a Father's Day gift. And also, it's the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima this August 6th, exactly 75 years to the day since the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Soon-to-be best-selling author Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday. Chris, always a pleasure. We'll catch you next week.
From your lips to God's ear. Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it. Talk to you next week.
It's the Perino and Steyerwalt I'll Tell You What podcast. Dana Perino of The Five and Fox News political editor Chris Steyerwalt dissect the ins and outs of national politics. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
Jane Collins has survived the Spanish flu and 2 world wars, and now she can add something else to that survival list, the coronavirus. She's 104 years old and lives in the UK. The Southwest News Service reports she's back at the care home where she lives in England. She's now one of the oldest people in the UK to contract COVID-19, and she recovered from it in just 10 days. She says she's feeling stronger every day and credits her love of champagne to helping her kick the virus. Her great niece, Sarah Balmforth, backs that up. Balmforth is a nurse and says her family was terrified when Jane was diagnosed in late April. They expected the worst. But Balmforth says her great-aunt has an iron constitution and is fiercely independent, even continuing to drive her car until she was 101. Jane worked in the healthcare industry before she retired, and she spent some of that time working in Royal Derby Hospital, the very place where she was treated for the coronavirus. Enjoy your cake and champagne, Jane, and here's to your health. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Jason Chaffetz.
What's on your mind?
Equal application of the law, justice, is what we all need to calm the country. Quote, the greatness of our nation comes from our commitment to the rule of law, end quote, said Attorney General William Barr. And he is correct. Without justice, everyone in our country is at risk. Everyone I spoke with on all sides of the political spectrum was sickened, disgusted, saddened, frightened, and mad about the apparent excessive force by Minneapolis police officer evidently carrying out his own justice on George Floyd, who was handcuffed and pinned to the ground for nearly 9 minutes. He died. It should have never happened. Unfortunately, there are a small number of people who seek chaos in the United States. They take advantage of tragedy and try to compound it with violence, fear, and rioting. While there must be swift justice for the death of George Floyd, there can be no acceptance of lawlessness. After 4 nights of violence and rioting in his city, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey boldly stated, this is no longer about protesting. This is about violence, and it has to stop. Perceptive, but unfortunately 4 nights too late. We should not tolerate rogue cops, nor should we tolerate protesters who go too far by stoking violence and breaking the law. Ultimately, the long-term solutions for peace, prosperity, and united communities will be found in families, neighborhoods, churches, safe schools, good jobs, and a justice system that is fair. They will be found in communities where Lady Justice wears a blindfold and equally administers the law, no matter who you are, where you came from, or who you know. Until that confidence is restored, no community deserves to be overrun with looting and fear. Order must be restored as the wheels of justice turn. Barr said, quote, we must have law and order on our streets and in our communities, and it is the responsibility of the local and state leadership in the first instance to halt this violence. The Department of Justice, including the FBI, Marshals, ATF, and DEA, and all of our 93 U.S. attorneys across the country will support these local efforts and take all action necessary to enforce federal law, end quote. The good news is solutions will be found in our local communities. where an individual's voice can have the most impact. If we wait for Congress to solve these issues, it most likely will never happen. These problems can be expeditiously addressed by prioritizing justice and rejecting fear and violence. I'm Jason Chaffetz, former member of Congress and Fox News contributor.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust, and click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.